A prisoner who found faith behind bars made one final request before facing death. He wanted the Virgin Mary tattooed over his heart. And what happened the next morning left an entire prison speechless. A miracle of the Virgin Mary, in the last place anyone expected to find one. But before we continue, tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is there right now. I want to see how far these stories travel. Deep in rural Arkansas stood a penitentiary most people tried not to think about. Concrete walls, steel doors, endless noise during the day, and a silence at night that felt heavier than the bars themselves. Inside that prison was a man nobody wanted near. Garrett Dunn, 34 years old, serving the kind of sentence that erases a future. When Garrett first arrived, inmates kept their distance instinctively. Not because he shouted, not because he fought, because of the way he carried himself. Cold, closed off, untouchable. In the cafeteria, he sat alone at the same corner table every single day, always with his back against the wall. If someone tried talking to him, they got a few words at most. Nothing more. Years passed like that. Same block, same silence. And nobody truly knew him. Until something began to change. The prison chaplain was the kind of man who refused to give up on people. Every week, he walked the cell blocks with the same calm patience. A greeting, a prayer, a conversation, sometimes just a quiet presence. Some inmates welcomed him. Others mocked him. Garrett ignored him completely. The chaplain would stop outside the cell. "Morning, Garrett." "Nothing. How are you holding up?" Silence. "There's a faith group meeting tonight, if you want to come." Garrett wouldn't even turn his head. He'd lie on the bunk staring at the ceiling as if the man didn't exist. This went on for months. Long enough that anyone else would have stopped trying. But the chaplain had spent years inside those walls. He had seen impossible transformations before, and he believed every man deserved at least one chance to be reached. One afternoon, he tried something different. No speech, no invitation, no questions. He simply placed a Bible on the floor outside Garrett's cell and walked away. That was it. Garrett stared at the book for a while before finally picking it up. He tossed it onto the metal table without opening it. And there it stayed, day after day, week after week, unopened, forgotten, until one sleepless night changed everything. The prison was quiet. Lights dimmed, distant footsteps echoing somewhere far down the corridor. Garrett sat up in bed, unable to sleep. Restless. Something pushed him toward the table. He grabbed the Bible, opened to a random page, started reading. One passage, then another, then another. At first it felt meaningless. Just words. But the pages kept turning. Without realizing it, hours passed. When he finally looked up, it was nearly 3 in the morning. He had read almost 40 pages. The next night, he opened it again. Then the next, and the next. Soon it became routine. Every night before bed, Garrett read. Not because someone told him to, because something inside him wanted to. The following week, the chaplain returned. This time Garrett was sitting on the bunk, Bible resting open in his lap. "There are parts one don't understand," Garrett said quietly. It was the first real conversation they had ever had. The chaplain smiled. Not the smile of surprise. The smile of someone who had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment. "Which parts?" he asked. And that was the beginning. After that, the visits changed. Garrett had questions every week. About forgiveness. About guilt. About whether someone who had done terrible things could still become something different. The chaplain never lied to him. Never offered easy answers. Never pretended everything could simply disappear. "You can't erase what you've done," he told Garrett once. "But you can decide who you become from this point forward." Garrett carried those words with him. Repeated them silently at night. Again and again. The conversations grew longer. Deeper. Sometimes the chaplain brought stories about other inmates who had changed. Men who arrived angry, broken, empty, and somehow left with peace. Garrett listened carefully to every story. For the first time in years, he no longer felt completely alone. One afternoon, the chaplain brought a rosary. He showed Garrett how to pray it. Garrett got the words wrong, forgot the order, mixed everything up. The chaplain corrected him patiently. By the third try, Garrett managed the entire prayer by himself. And slowly, something inside him softened. Not overnight. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like roots growing beneath the surface before anyone notices the tree has changed. Eventually, Garrett started attending the prison's faith gatherings. He still barely spoke. Still kept mostly to himself. But the men around him noticed it. The guards noticed it too. He wasn't the same man anymore. And then the day came. One Tuesday morning, an officer stopped outside Garrett's cell. He informed him that the date had been set. The sentence would be carried out soon. Garrett listened in silence. Nodded once. The officer walked away. Garrett sat on the bunk for a long time before finally kneeling on the concrete floor. He reached beneath the pillow, pulled out the rosary, and prayed. The weeks after that were difficult. He barely ate. Sleep became rare. But every night, without fail, he prayed before closing his eyes. 3 weeks before the date, another officer approached his cell. "You're allowed one final request," the man said. "What do you want?" Garrett answered immediately. "I want a tattoo." The officer frowned slightly and wrote it down. "What kind?" Garrett lifted his eyes. "The Virgin Mary," he said quietly. "On my chest." The request eventually reached the warden. And the warden already knew Garrett's story. He had watched the change happen slowly over time. The man standing there now was nothing like the one who first entered those prison gates. The warden called Garrett into his office. "I saw your request," he said. "Why the Virgin Mary?" Garrett answered without hesitation. "Because I want to take her with me." He paused. "And I want the last thing people see on me to be her." The warden studied him silently for a moment, then nodded. "I'll approve it." The prison contacted a professional tattoo artist from a nearby town. His name was Clint Adler. When he received the call explaining the situation, he went silent for several seconds. A prison, a final request, a Virgin Mary tattoo. Still, he agreed. Thursday morning, one day before the scheduled execution, Clint arrived at the penitentiary at 8 sharp. Security checked every piece of equipment he carried. Needles, ink, machines, everything. A guard escorted him through long concrete corridors and heavy steel doors until they reached a small administrative room. Metal table, one chair, harsh fluorescent lighting overhead. Clint unpacked slowly, organized the inks, tested the machine, prepared 3 sketches he had drawn the night before. Different versions of the Virgin Mary, different expressions, different styles. A few minutes later, Garrett entered the room escorted by 2 guards. He removed his shirt, sat down quietly in the chair, and for the first time, the artist really looked at him. Clint placed the 3 sketches side by side on the metal table. Garrett studied each one quietly. Then he reached out and rested his finger on the center design. The Virgin Mary with a veil over her head. Calm expression, detailed, but simple enough to feel real. "That one," Garrett said. Clint nodded. He moved closer, examining Garrett's chest carefully before choosing the placement. After positioning the stencil, he stepped back slightly. "Like this?" Clint asked. Garrett lowered his eyes to the mirror. For a few seconds, he simply stared. Then he nodded once. "Yeah," he said softly. "That's her." The machine buzzed to life. And almost immediately, Garrett noticed something strange. It didn't hurt. That made no sense. He had tattoos from years earlier. He remembered exactly what tattoo pain felt like, especially on the chest. The chest was brutal. But now, nothing. No burning. No sharp sting. No soreness. Only pressure. A strange numbness spread across his skin while the needle moved over him. Garrett found it unsettling, but kept quiet. As Clint worked, Garrett slowly began talking. Not casually. Not like small conversation. Like a man opening doors he had kept locked for years. He spoke about his childhood. About his mother. About the choices that led him into darkness. About prison. About the emptiness that swallowed him after he arrived there. "When I first came here," Garrett said quietly, "I didn't believe in anything." Clint kept working while listening. Not in God. Not in people. Not even in myself. The tattoo machine hummed steadily in the room. Line by line, the image began taking shape. First the outline of the face, then the eyes, then the veil. And while Clint worked, he noticed something deeply unusual. The tattoo was coming out different, sharper, cleaner, more alive than anything he had ever done before. 25 years tattooing, thousands of clients. And somehow, this piece looked beyond his own ability. Same machine, same technique, but the result felt almost guided. He kept going in silence, unsettled by what he was seeing. Garrett continued talking, not because anyone forced him to, because for the first time in his life, he wanted someone to understand who he had become. "Faith didn't hit me all at once," he admitted. "It happened slowly." Clint glanced up briefly. "Like what?" he asked. Garrett stared at the ceiling. "Like something filling a place inside me that I thought would stay empty forever." The machine continued moving across his chest. I didn't turn into a saint, Garrett said after a while. I just became someone who can finally look in the mirror without hating what he sees. Clint paused for half a second. That's a lot, he murmured. Garrett shook his head slowly. No, he whispered. That's everything. Hours passed. Still no pain. Garrett closed his eyes while the needle worked over his skin. 3 full hours. And not once did his chest react the way it should have. Anyone who has ever gotten a tattoo knows what happens after a while. The skin burns. Muscles tighten. Your body starts fighting back. But Garrett felt absolutely nothing. Only calm. Finally, Clint stepped away. It's done. Garrett stood slowly and looked into the mirror. The Virgin Mary stared back from his chest. Gentle eyes. Peaceful face. The image looked almost impossibly alive beneath the fluorescent lights. For a long moment, Garrett couldn't speak. Clint carefully covered the tattoo with protective film. Then the guards escorted Garrett out of the room. Halfway down the hallway, Garrett stopped suddenly. Roses. The scent hit him all at once. Strong. Fresh. Impossible. He turned his head instinctively. Nothing. Empty corridor. Concrete walls. Steel doors. No flowers anywhere. The guard beside him kept walking normally, completely unaffected. As if he smelled nothing at all. But Garrett smelled it clearly. Fresh roses. The fragrance lingered for several seconds before fading away as mysteriously as it had appeared. And with it came something else. Peace. Not ordinary calm. Something deeper. A stillness so complete it almost frightened him. Back in his cell, Garrett sat quietly on the bunk. He rested his hand over the tattoo, over the Virgin Mary, and prayed, not asking for escape, not begging for mercy, simply grateful for the faith he had found, for the chaplain who never stopped coming back, for the strange peace that somehow reached him inside those prison walls. Then Garrett lay down and slept, deeply, completely, the kind of sleep he hadn't experienced in years. Morning came, still dark outside. Garrett woke before sunrise. He dressed slowly in the clean clothes prepared for him and sat waiting in silence. Can you imagine what it feels like to wait for something like that? To know exactly what the day is supposed to bring? Garrett waited calmly. Then suddenly, bang, a guard slammed against the bars. Too early. Something was wrong. Garrett, get up, the guard said quickly. Your lawyer's here. Garrett frowned. My lawyer. The guards escorted him into the visiting room. Spencer was already there waiting. Suit wrinkled, tie crooked, breathing hard like he had run the entire way. And in his hand was a stack of papers. Garrett, Spencer said immediately. We gotta stay. Garrett stared at him blankly. What? A stay, Spencer repeated. They stopped it. For several seconds Garrett couldn't process the words. Spencer sat down across from him and exhaled hard. My team has been reviewing your case for weeks, he explained. Every report, every testimony, every procedural step. He leaned forward. And yesterday we found serious errors. Garrett listened without moving. Witnesses who should have testified never got called. Evidence was ignored. Important procedures were skipped entirely. Spencer looked directly at him. Garrett, your original trial was compromised. Garrett slowly leaned back in the chair. His hand instinctively moved to his chest, resting over the tattoo beneath his shirt. Just in time, he whispered. Spencer noticed the movement. Garrett's shirt collar had shifted slightly open, revealing part of the protective film and the outline underneath. Is that? Spencer asked quietly. The Virgin Mary, Garrett answered. I got it yesterday. Spencer looked at the image, then at the court order in his hands, then back at Garrett. A long silence filled the room. Finally, Spencer spoke. A new trial is being scheduled, he said. And with what we found, everything changes. The news spread through the prison before lunchtime. Everyone knew. The inmate scheduled for execution had received a last-minute stay because of major errors in his case. Some called it luck. Some called it coincidence. Others called it a miracle. Garrett never argued with anyone. Whenever people asked him about it, he would simply place a hand over his chest and quietly change the subject. The months that followed felt different. Not because prison changed. Because Garrett changed again. Now there was something inside him that hadn't existed before. Hope. Spencer worked nonstop outside the prison walls. He tracked down witnesses that had been ignored years earlier. Some had moved away. Some lived in other states. Still, Spencer found them. He rebuilt the case piece by piece. Prepared every document as if the entire future depended on it. Because it did. Inside the prison, Garrett's story kept spreading. Guards talked about it during shifts. Inmates whispered about it in the cafeteria and the yard. Some believed, some didn't. But everyone knew the story. And unexpectedly, inmates started approaching Garrett. Not to fight, not to mock him, to talk. They wanted to understand how a man facing death could remain so calm. Garrett never preached, never pushed faith on anyone. If someone asked, he simply told the truth. How faith arrived slowly, quietly, and changed him from the inside out. Most men listened and walked away. But every once in a while, one stayed longer. And sooner or later, that man usually ended up asking the chaplain for a Bible. Finally, the day of the hearing arrived. Garrett woke before dawn, put on the clothes laid out for him, prayed silently, then rested his hand over the Virgin Mary tattoo on his chest. The guards came for him shortly afterward. The drive to the courthouse took 40 minutes. When Garrett arrived, officers escorted him through a side entrance. Spencer was already there waiting. Suit pressed, briefcase open, documents perfectly organized. And beyond the courtroom doors, the witnesses waited. Months of work, hundreds of pages, dozens of interviews. Everything had led to this room. The exact same courtroom where Garrett had once heard the sentence that destroyed his future. Same walls, same kind of table, same heavy silence hanging in the air. But this time, something felt different. The hearing lasted 3 days. On the first day, Spencer dismantled the original case piece by piece. Every procedural failure, every ignored detail, every step that should never have happened. The courtroom listened in silence as the foundation of the old verdict slowly cracked apart. On the second day, the witnesses spoke. People who should have testified years earlier. People whose voices had never been heard. One after another, they added new layers to the story. New perspectives, new truths. And with every testimony, the certainty of the original sentence weakened further. Garrett sat quietly through all of it, hand resting over his chest, over the Virgin Mary tattoo beneath his shirt. On the third day came the final arguments. Spencer stood before the court and spoke for nearly an hour. Not loudly, not dramatically, carefully, clearly, like a man carrying the weight of someone else's life in every sentence. When he finished, the courtroom fell silent. And then the judge delivered the decision. The original sentence was overturned. Garrett Dunn would receive a new sentence. This one measured in years instead of death. And because he had already spent so much time behind bars, most of it had already been served. For the first time since entering prison, Garrett had a release date. A real date. A day marked on a calendar that no longer represented an ending, but a beginning. When the judge finished reading the ruling, Garrett didn't react immediately. No tears. No shouting. No dramatic collapse. He simply sat there, with his hand pressed lightly against his chest, as if grounding himself in something only he understood. The next day, Spencer returned to the prison. He sat across from Garrett in the visitation room, reviewing paperwork, timelines, and release procedures. Everything felt strangely unreal. Finally, Garrett looked up. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For everything." Spencer nodded once, then stood, shook Garrett's hand firmly, and left. That night, Garrett prayed the entire rosary from beginning to end. Slowly, carefully, not missing a single word. The months afterward changed him even more. The chaplain noticed it immediately. Garrett was still reserved, still quiet, still the same man in many ways. But something inside him had settled. There was gratitude in him now, the kind that doesn't need to be spoken out loud. You could see it in his eyes. One afternoon, the chaplain stopped by carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one through the bars. "Garrett," he said after a while, "can I ask you something?" Garrett nodded. "Do you think what happened was a miracle?" Garrett took a slow sip before answering. For a moment, he stared down into the coffee like he was searching for the right words there. "The errors were always in the case," he said finally. "Maybe someone would have found them eventually." The chaplain tilted his head slightly. "But," Garrett looked up, "but they found them the day after the tattoo." Silence. "Right in time," Garrett added softly. The chaplain smiled faintly. Garrett leaned back against the wall. "Coincidence is a comfortable word," he said. "It explains everything without asking much from us." He rested his hand over the tattoo again. But when every piece falls into place at the exact same moment, when everything points in the same direction, he paused. "At some point, you stop calling it coincidence." The chaplain stayed quiet. "What do you call it?" he asked. Garrett's expression softened. "An answer," he whispered. Another silence settled between them. Not awkward. Peaceful. I asked, Garrett said quietly. And I received. He looked down at the rosary in his hands. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life being grateful for that. The chaplain smiled. You know, he said, the best decision I ever made. Garrett looked up. Was leaving that Bible outside your cell and walking away. For the first time in a long while, Garrett laughed. A real laugh. Quiet, but genuine. Today, Garrett touches the Virgin Mary tattoo on his chest every single morning. The tattoo that somehow didn't hurt. The tattoo he thought would be his final request. And deep inside, with a certainty stronger than logic, he knows something now. He was never alone. Not even in that place. Not even then. And for Garrett, that truth is enough. And if you made it this far to the end of Garrett's story, write tattoo in the comments. Because it was the tattoo that changed everything. And every time I see that word, I'll know one more person still believes miracles can happen in the darkest places imaginable. If this story touched your heart, subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you've ever experienced something you still can't fully explain, share it below. Someone out there may need to read it today. May the Virgin Mary continue blessing and protecting you and your family. Amen.